History is a story of turning points, of singular moments on which the fate of empires and ideas pivots. Most are loud, unmistakable bolts of lightning, but some are quieter, desperate gambles made in the dark, whose true significance is only understood centuries later. This is a story of the second kind, a story about the true cost of survival. History loves to tell us stories of heroes, the ones who stood against tyranny, the saviors of civilization, but it rarely tells of the brutal calculus behind their courage. The price paid not just in blood on the battlefield, but in the soul of the victor. What if, to fight a monster, you had to become one? What if the greatest act of defiance in a generation was also an unpardonable sin? This is the story of such a sin, one that saved a world from an unstoppable tide. It is the story of a fateful battle where the myth of invincibility was shattered, and of a hero who paid for his victory with his own life. This is the story of the Battle of Ain Jalut. In the mid-13th century, a power erupted from the steppes of Central Asia. They were not merely an army, they were a force of nature, a firestorm on horseback, a new definition of conquest. The Mongols, under the vision of Genghis Khan and the brutal efficiency of his successors, they had forged the largest contiguous land empire the world has ever seen. But their empire wasn't built on military strength alone. It was built on a far more insidious weapon, psychological terror. The Mongol doctrine was a masterclass in weaponized fear. The strategy was simple: make a horrific, unforgettable example of one city to terrify 100 others into submission. They perfected this on the plains of Persia and Central Asia. The Khwarezmian Empire, a flourishing power, was systematically annihilated. At great cities like Samarkand and Bukhara, centers of learning and culture, they didn't just conquer, they erased. Populations were massacred, with engineers and artisans spared only to be used in the next siege. They built grotesque pyramids from human skulls. Ancient irrigation systems that had sustained life for centuries were destroyed, turning fertile farmlands into barren desert. This wasn't mindless savagery. It was calculated, state-sponsored terror designed to break the human will to resist. And in 1258, that weapon was perfected at Baghdad. The city was the heart of the Islamic Abbasid Caliphate, a metropolis of 1 million souls. It was home to the House of Wisdom, a library and academy that preserved the knowledge of the ancient Greeks and Persians. Under the command of Hulagu Khan, a grandson of Genghis, the city was besieged and utterly destroyed. The caliph himself was rolled in a carpet and trampled to death by horses to avoid spilling royal blood on the earth. The city's libraries were emptied into the Tigris. The river, it was said, ran black with the ink of 1 million books before it ran red with the blood of the dead. The news of this annihilation was not a tragedy. It was a message sent across the world. Look what happens to those who resist us. Submit, or you are next. The death of the spirit was the prelude to physical destruction. And as that darkness swept west towards Egypt, the last great bastion of Islamic power, nearly everyone believed that surrender was the only logical path to survival. But in the darkest hour, there are always the outliers, the defiant ones. They are not born kings in palaces or knights with spotless ideals. They are the flawed, the tainted, the outsiders. The ones who dare to fight back precisely because they have nothing left to lose. In Egypt, that man was Sultan Saif ad-Din Qutuz. He was not of Egyptian royal blood. He was a former slave. In a cruel twist of fate, he had been born a prince of the Khwarezmian Empire, the very one crushed by Genghis Khan decades earlier. He had witnessed the destruction of his homeland, was captured, and sold as property in the slave markets of Damascus. He was a Mamluk, one of the owned. The Mamluks were a unique military caste, slave boys purchased from the Turkic tribes of the steppe, brought to the barracks of the Cairo citadel, and forged into the world's deadliest soldiers. In this strange system, a slave could rise to become a general, even a sultan. It was a life of brutal meritocracy. Qutuz's defiance did not come from patriotism alone. It came from a place of deep personal indignation, from the memory of a blood debt that had haunted him his entire life. He wasn't fighting for a crown he had seized. He was fighting to avenge the ghosts of his stolen past. And then the deadly proposal arrived. Hulagu Khan's envoys delivered the ultimatum, an elegant letter demanding an unconditional surrender. To the emirs and advisors in Qutuz's court, it was a logical choice. It was better to live as vassals, to pay tribute and save their lives and their city, than to die as martyrs in a hopeless war. But Qutuz, who had lived in subjugation, saw a different truth. He saw a slow death in surrender, a death of culture, of honor, of the soul. He stood before an impossible choice, a swift, agonizing death in defiance, or a slow, soulless death in servitude. And he chose, but in order to fight, he had to commit an unpardonable sin. By the sacred laws of every nation from east to west, the person of an envoy was inviolable. To kill an envoy was the ultimate act of barbarism, a closing of all diplomatic doors, an insult that could only be answered with annihilation. Qutuz ordered the Mongol envoys cut in half and their heads displayed on the Zuila Gate of Cairo. This was not a tactical decision. It was a personal gamble of the highest order. With that single savage act, he bet everything, his own life, the lives of his people, and his very soul. He broke the rules of the civilized world to fight an enemy he deemed beyond civilization. He had burned his bridges to the ground. From that moment, there was no turning back. There was only victory or utter annihilation. Qutuz's gamble immediately revealed its price: absolute isolation. He had hoped his defiance would inspire a unified Islamic front, but the other Muslim princes in Syria were either already crushed or had become Mongol vassals. He appealed to his old enemies, the Christian crusaders in the fortress of Acre. The crusaders were playing a dangerous game of geopolitics. Some, like the ruler of Antioch, had already submitted to the Mongols. But the knights at Acre, after fierce debate, made a cold calculation. They hated the Mamluks, but they feared the Mongols more. All Qutuz received was a frigid neutrality. They would not hinder him, but they would not help him either. Worse, back in Cairo, factions within his own Mamluk army were plotting betrayal. They saw him as a madman leading them to their doom. He was utterly alone. Alone with his impossible plan, besieged by doubt from without and betrayal from within. The psychological pressure rested on the shoulders of one man who had to believe in himself when no one else would. But in isolation, brilliance can flourish. Qutuz and his genius, ruthless general, Baybars, another former slave, did not seek to match strength with strength. They sought a weakness, not a weakness of arms, but a weakness of the mind and of culture. They knew the Mongol art of war was based on mobility, firepower from their composite bows, and relentless offensive pressure. But they also knew its flaw. The Mongols' arrogance was a strategic liability. After decades of victory, they had developed an almost pathological obsession with the chase. They saw a fleeing enemy as an insult to their warrior pride and could not resist the urge to crush them completely. The feigned retreat was their signature move, and they believed no one would dare or be disciplined enough to use it against them. The plan was forged, not to defeat the enemy, but to lure the enemy into defeating themselves. They chose a specific battlefield, a valley in Palestine with that prophetic name, Ain Jalut, Goliath's Spring. The terrain was the key. It was a natural trap, with hills on either side that could conceal the bulk of the Mamluk heavy cavalry. The tension of this war of nerves is best seen not through the eyes of generals, but through a young, anonymous Mamluk soldier. Let's call him Khalid. Like many of his comrades, he was purchased from the Kipchak steppes as a boy. He grew up on boogeyman stories of the Mongols, of the demons on horseback who had destroyed his distant homeland. Now, he and thousands of others lay hidden in the scorching hills of Ain Jalut. The heat was suffocating. The maddening buzz of flies was constant. The waiting was a form of torture that frayed the nerves. He knew nothing of the grand plan. He knew only the taste of brackish water, the stench of nervous sweat, and the gnawing dread of facing an enemy spoken of as a divine punishment. This was the silent sacrifice, the price paid in every terrifying, drawn-out second by the nameless soldiers, the pawns on the chessboard of kings. And then they came, a dust cloud on the horizon that grew into a dark line of horsemen, a low rumble that grew into the thunder of 20,000 hooves. The Mongol army, under the command of the battle-hardened Kitbuka, charged into the valley, falling for the bait perfectly. The Mamluk vanguard, led by Baybars, performed the feigned retreat, a masterful piece of military theater. But it was a performance on a razor's edge, nearly turning into a genuine rout under the storm of Mongol arrows and the sheer ferocity of the charge. The battle hung in the balance. This was the golden opportunity. The enemy was overextended, their formation stretched thin. their discipline compromised by the thrill of the chase. In the heart of the chaos, when every instinct screamed to hold the line and defend, Qutuz gave an impossible order: full assault. It was an extraordinary act of decisiveness, transforming years of fear and days of suspense into a hurricane of action. The entire hidden Mamluk army erupted from the hillsides like an avalanche of steel, turning the trap into a meat grinder. The pincer movement worked. The Mamluk heavy cavalry, larger, more heavily armored and bred for the shock of the charge, crashed into the disordered Mongol flanks. The Mongol bow, so deadly at a distance, was nullified in the brutal, close-quarters melee. The invincible had been defeated at Ain Jalut. But the camera does not pan up to waving banners. It stays on the ground. It lingers on the aftermath, a sea of blood, a tangled mass of men and horses. The surviving Mamluk soldiers stand unsteadily, exhausted and shell-shocked, their eyes hollow. There are no triumphant cheers, only the heavy silence of loss and carnage. This victory did not bring glory. It brought survival at a brutal, devastating price. And the final, most cruel price was paid after the battle was over. Qutuz, the hero who had saved a civilization, the man who had gambled everything and won, would not live to enjoy his victory. On the triumphant journey back to Cairo, while the city prepared a hero's welcome, he was assassinated during a hunting trip. The architect of his death, none other than his own brilliant general, Baybars. The motives are debated by historians to this day. Was it pure ambition, a preemptive strike against a sultan he feared would remove him, or a conspiracy among the emirs? The result was the same. The hero of Ain Jalut died not at the hands of his great enemy, but at the hands of his own comrade. It poses a brutal, lingering question. Does a victory even matter if it consumes the very hero who achieved it? The legacy of Ain Jalut is therefore a dual legacy, a complicated truth. On one hand, it saved the Islamic world from annihilation, stopped the Mongol tide cold, and indirectly shielded Europe. Baybars, the betrayer, ironically became one of the greatest sultans in Mamluk history. He was a brilliant statesman and warrior who would go on to repel further Mongol invasions and drive the last of the Crusaders from the mainland. He was, in truth, the shield of Islam. But on the other hand, the victory also cemented the Mamluk system, a military regime built on the institutionalized trade of slave boys, a system rife with paranoia, and a political culture where assassination was a common tool of succession. The paradox is stark. A system of profound internal violence was required to save the region from an even greater external one. History is rarely a story of good versus evil. It is a story of choices and their complex, often tragic consequences. In the end, the story closes on a grim, repeating loop. The victory at Ain Jalut was not the end of the war. It was, at best, the end of the beginning. The Mongol Ilkhanate in Persia would regroup and return to attack Syria again and again for the next 50 years. The Mamluks had to live in a state of perpetual vigilance, a constant preparation for the next war. The soldier who survived Marathon had to keep running to Athens to deliver the news. The soldier who survived Ain Jalut simply had to reload his quiver and prepare to fight again. The cost of defiance, the price of survival, is to be eternally vigilant. History is never a straight line. The boundary between hero and tyrant, between salvation and destruction, is often tragically blurred. So what do you believe is the true cost of defiance? And is any victory worth that price? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this complex story from history resonated with you, subscribe to our channel as we uncover more hidden truths behind the world's greatest legends.